For oral answer. Question number 1, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements? Sorry, does he still stand by... Well, it's so obvious.
Order. Order. Order.
The still being the operative word. Does he still stand by all his statements? If so, why?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, because I find them more accurate and more coherent than the members' questions.
That from the man famous for his
Order.
diction.
We'll just have the supplementary question.
What a joke. Prime Minister, which of the following statements does he stand by? Quotes, slowly rising house prices in Auckland are not good. End of quotes. Quotes, the Auckland housing market has been rising a little faster than the government would want. End of quotes. Or we take responsibility. We need to do a better job of it, or my favourite, there is not a housing crisis.
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, all of them in the context they were made.
Well, apart from the sucking in
Order.
aerobics.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston
Apart from the
Peters.
sucking in aerobics, Prime Minister.
Order. Order. Order.
Oh.
No. We'll have the supplementary question in line with standing orders.
Can I ask the Prime Minister, how can he say he has confidence in Nick Smith undertaking, quotes, a wide range of initiatives when it comes to housing, end of quotes, when there is an overwhelming majority of New Zealanders now who simply do not agree with him?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, because it's a statement of absolute fact that Minister Smith has done a great deal in the housing area, including in seeing $34 million a week used to subsidise New Zealanders into housing, seeing 40 new houses a day built in Auckland, seeing 154 special housing areas created in Auckland, which will release up to 56,000 homes. It's seen Crown land released. It's seen 12,000 families being able to access KiwiSaver Home Start, along with the tax changes that have been made. Mr. Speaker, the changes have been very significant.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
How can he have confidence in a minister that makes Morris Williamson look like Keith A. Holmes? or describe him as being, quotes, outstanding, and further, doing the best he can? Or is it a case of don't blame John, Nick did it? Don't blame Nick, John told him to.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's probably true that Morris Williamson started his political career living in a Keith Hay home, but that member started living in a log cabin.
Order. 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 There is just too much interjection. I invite the Right Honourable Winston Peters if he has a further supplementary.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right
Prime
Honourable Winston
Minister,
Peters.
does he agree with an infamous New Zealander who said, and I quote him, we are facing a severe home affordability and ownership crisis. The crisis has reached dangerous levels in recent years and looks set to get worse, end of quotes. If not, why not?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, no.
Prime Minister,
Supplementary question.
Is the Prime
Right
Minister
Honourable
aware-
Winston Peters.
is the Prime Minister aware that he was the one who said that?
Speaker,
Right Honourable
I was in
Prime
government, I
Minister.
didn't.
Prime Minister?
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Prime Minister, is the Prime Minister able to remember any promise an hour after he's made it?
The Right Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my memory's not going.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston
Does the
Peters.
Prime Minister remember saying that the TPPA would bring $5 billion to this country by 2025, $5 billion to this country by 2025, when there is not one other expert in the world who agrees with that? And which country was he talking about when he said that?
The Right Honourable
Speaker,
Prime
New
Minister.
Zealand.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston
Does the
Peters.
Prime Minister remember warning New Zealanders how he didn't want them to become tenants in their own country And that being the case, could he tell us what his discussions were with the leader of the Chinese communications arm of the Chinese Communist government yesterday? Did they concern, for example, the takeover of Silver Fern Farms, rising foreign ownership in this country, or being treated as though he was a head of state?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I didn't raise those particular points, but nor was it some sort of secret meeting, given I put a picture on my Facebook site of meeting the man.
Question number 2.